Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, whichever crust and corner of the world that you're joining us from. Welcome to this very important and amazing virtual launch. A first time for everyone, but I think this is going to be fantastic. Just want to say that we're launching our very esteemed and highly awaited Eskom Transformed, a Just Energy Transition for South Africa report. And it has been compiled by AIDC, TNI, and TUED with support from FES. So, comrades, I know there's also other comrades in the call with us who are affiliated and part of other organizations. And just to introduce some of the organizations, the AIDC is an activist think tank seeking to bring together grassroots community organizations working towards a wage-led, low-carbon development path for Southern Africa. We have TUED, which is Trade Union for Energy Democracy, and TUED is a global multi-sector trade union initiative to advance democratic direction and control of energy. The Transnational Institute is an international research and advocacy institute committed to building a just, democratic, and sustainable world. We have comrades from the National Union of Metal Workers of South Africa. We have comrades from the National Labour and Economic Development Institute. We have comrades from the National Union of Mine Workers, and of course, comrades from the South African Federation of Trade Unions. Today, my esteemed and extremely wonderful panel is joining me, and I have Enos and Mbodi from NUMSA, Sandra van Niekerk from the AIDC, Sweeney from TUED, Hameda Deedat from Naledi, David Fankomo from NU, Dominic Brown from the AIDC, Zwelinzima Vavi from SAF2, and Fiona from TNI. Thank you once again, comrades, for joining me, and thank you for all those that are watching. I think the issues around Eskom have been on our minds, and of course, the past 2 weeks or so, a week ago, we've been facing broad load shedding, so it brought it to the fore again, and I'm hoping that the conversation we'll be having today will sort of push comrades to understand that it's very important for electricity and energy to be a public good. So just to let comrades know that we're not going to be having sort of the quintessential webinar style where people are going to be giving inputs and we get exhausted after 30 minutes. We're having a conversation. We're all going to be talking about how we're thinking of transforming Eskom and why it's important to transform it. So how the speakers are lined up is how I called them. So we're going to have Ndate Enos and Mbodi sort of stressing the importance of the report itself for unions. And then we're going to have Sandra van Niekerk giving us an overview of the research document itself. Sweeney is going to come in and dispel all the myths around unbundling and challenges around public utilities. And then we're going to have Hameda Deedat come through and sort of talk about how trade unions used to be, because most of the time we're talking about trade unions be pro-coal, but much more she'll be stressing the issue around how trade unions need to focus on climate change and the demand and need for a just transition. And also we'll be looking at issues of how, or rejecting the idea that the labor movement does not see an importance for clean energy transition. Then David Fankomo is going to be looking at how this report itself reinforces why we should be opposing unbundling, which is a cool word for privatization, by the way. And then Dominic Brown is going to be talking about the factors that contribute to Eskom's high level of indebtedness and issues around why is it bad to use the fiscus to save Eskom. Then we're going to sort of give it a brief opportunity to do a very, very brief question and answer period. So please make sure that you pose your questions on the Q&A panel, and which is right at the bottom there. So please pose your questions on the Q&A panel, and any comments like you're wanting to say hi or let us know that you're in the room with us, please post it on the chat. And then after the Q&A, we'll let comrade Zwelinzima Vavi take us through a very deep and serious political intervention. And then closer to the end, Comrade Fiona will be pulling each and every single important point together, but stressing how we need to globally come together. And then we can all go home and drive safe. So that being said, I am going then to hand over to Comrade Enos.
Good afternoon, comrades. And thank you for the opportunity. And we think it is very, very important to acknowledge AIDC and all other organizations that have already been mentioned that were involved in the formulation of this document, which is very, very useful. But it will be important to first indicate that indeed, as a trade union, we believe that we should play in a policy formulation stage. And when we do that, we need properly researched outputs, things that are not gonna be thumbsucked, things that comes out of a process of researching properly. And we are happy that we do have our own research unit. It is important to not only solely look at what we would have done internally, but also look at other spaces where we can play in the research space. And we are happy that we have been involved in this process. But we need to clarify certain things before we continue. What is important here is for things to be clarified to such an extent that anybody who would listen to us may not second guess us as NUMSA. And we have got a resolution that was passed, and that resolution was processed in the highest decision making structure of the organization. And that resolution reads as follows: towards a socially owned renewable sector. Now, in essence, what it implies is we are not opposed to renewable energy. Renewable energy or low carbon footprint is important, but what we are directing our thought to and is towards a socially owned renewable sector. And it's not strange, because we are a Marxist-Leninist organization, that we think that the poor and the working class need to be at the center of whatever it is that is the transformation, the energy transition. And not only that, that they become a part of energy democracy from the beginning, right from the onset. When a decision is made on the energy mix, they need to be involved. And when the decision has been made that this is the energy mix, they need to play part. We need to play part. Socially owned renewable sector means we cannot exclude the poor and the working class, as the system has already done that now. In essence, we cannot trust capitalism to give to us a just transition without putting effort. And the effort that we are putting is making sure that we indicate from the onset that we are for a socially owned renewable sector. And what that means is we are not opposed to renewable energy. And this is what maybe many people may be confused about. We don't have a position or a resolution in NUMSA that opposes renewable energy. But what we are keen about, and I believe that all organizations that are pro-poor, working class, and also representative of the workers will talk about the form of transition from fossil to renewable energy. And at the center, it's something that we know globally is known as energy and just transition. And we know that we can't just simply cut, copy, and paste. We need to contextualize it according to our problems and our challenges that we have in the country. So just transition, we are not only focusing on the shop floor issues. We are looking at this broadly, and I'm glad that this report that we have, this research report, covers the ground very well, because we do believe that we have got ecological issues. We also have economic issues and social issues to look at when we deal with the issue of just transition. We cannot emphasize it better that we need a balance. We need a fair and just transition, which means nobody should be left at a worst of state when that transition would have happened. Ecologically, we need to be sound, but socially we also need not leave anybody outside. And when we say socially and economically, we mean the poor and working class, inclusive of the people where we come from. We work in companies. We also represent workers who have got homes in the community. So you cannot separate the community, the workers and the community. You cannot also separate ecological damage from us, because we are part of the environment also. So it is important that just transition be looked at in a balanced way. We are not avoiding the fact that there are jobs to make sure that we also look at, but the balance is in making sure that whenever things move, we have got our grasp on the fairness and justice. Of course, there are other underlying issues that we need to look at: the issue of redirection of skills, the issue of making sure that the skills supporting the transition and people do not get left out unattended. Okay, the other thing that we as NUMSA would have wanted in our thought, we do believe that an Eskom that is properly managed, the Eskom that has got a governance structure that is inclusive of the organized communities and trade unions and all other players, other than just a corporate board and a corporatized Eskom, will be able, if given a chance, be able to play a role in renewable energy. We do know that there should be some sort of transformation or making sure that that works. But we believe that it is possible for them to play in the space, provided they have transformed in a way in which we are not going to be kicking the ball to the wrong person. So it is very, very important that it be noted. And we just gathered that from Eskom that they have submitted a business case that they do believe will be considered and all that, but there has been no feedback so far. But for us, it is important to note that just transition is at the center, so that nobody, for instance, I will make an example with places like Emalahleni. You can't have a situation where we only look at, I'm just gonna make an example of that place, only look merely on the issues of the ecological damage only, without connecting with social and economical issues. For instance, I mean, you would understand that Emalahleni, the local economy there is connected to power stations and coal mining, for instance, which actually means houses built there, businesses that are there, and people that reside in that space are residing at that space because of the economic activity there. It will be a bad thing to not imagine the importance of involving, and which we believe is covered in the report, of involving the community and the community organizations. That is basically why, as NUMSA, we do believe that this has got a lot more to do with the total society. Energy democracy tries to make sure that there is inclusivity than to create an exclusive club that is led by capitalism. That is one thing that we don't want to do. As NUMSA, we believe that the research report will give us something to look at, something to refer to, whenever there are things that are on the blind spot of what we have researched, we know that there is some other documents that we played part in, which we can go and look at to inform ourselves. We do believe that research really is not static. We believe that as and when circumstances and conditions change, there will be other aspects that will need relooking into. But as of now, this forms a very good place to start to look at, and I'm happy that that has been recorded, that socially owned renewable sector and energy democracy is at the center, the issue of making sure that we are putting everything in its place and not only merely looking at jobs, because that will be a very short-sighted and abstract way of looking at just transition. So that is basically where we are at, and we are happy that we took part. And we do believe that as and when there are issues that we pick up, because we'll have to put our ears on the ground, as and when there are issues that are the policy direction of the government, because now and then it does change, we would need to be quick, because as and when it changes, we cannot have a research which is static. Would need to move quick enough to make sure that we have got the ground covered. I think that is basically where we are at, and I think at the moment, I will hand over back to you as the facilitator, and be thankful that we were even invited to be part of this research policy formulation. And we know past this, there may be other things that we might have to do. I mean, using the documents, we can inform our campaigns. We can inform activities that will involve all stakeholders, all community organizations that are connected to this, and all other organizations and trade unions. And I'm happy that our fellow trade unionists are there. I see Comrade David is here on behalf of NUM, and I also see Comrade Vavi on behalf of SAFTU. And I think it is important that this research be used as a springboard to campaigns and other actions that we inform other actions that we might have to take to make sure that there is just transition and an inclusive just transition at that. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Comrade Enos. I was about to exercise my powers as chair and sort of curb you, but then you said some beautiful things about the fact that we need to use this document for our campaigns, which is actually important. And I think is one of the reasons why we're doing this, and one of the reasons why we put together this document and this particular launch. We're not just trying to sort of draft together 150 pages and say, go forth and flourish, but wanting to act. So thanks so much for that, Comrade Enos. So I'm just going to give over then to Comrade Sandra to come in and give us an overview of the report.
Thanks. I'm trying to share my screen, but it is not letting me do that. Okay. So let me just try and get it to play. I don't think I can. Is it all right just the way it is?
Yeah, I think
I can't work out how to get it to play at the same time as sharing it. That's my only problem. Is it all right? Let me see. Okay, there we go. Okay, that'll have to do. Okay, so thanks very much, Kia, and thanks very much, Comrade Mbodi, for that introduction and for talking about the importance of this report. It's been a long process, but there's been a lot of issues and a lot of toing and froing and discussing that has had to happen. But we're very happy that we finally got to a point where we are ready to share this report in a more coherent way with everybody. I think people have been hearing bits and pieces of it for a long time, and now is an opportunity for everybody to get an overall view of what we've been talking about. Okay, when I share my screen, I can't move the, okay. Sorry, I can't move the, never mind, I'll talk to my slides. Maybe if it's possible for Rikang to get my slides and then you can get him to open it.
No,
Okay,
for sure,
so
we'll help you in the background, but don't worry, just go ahead, Sandra.
Yeah,
Your
no, I'm
lovely
gonna
voice
go
is enough.
So the electricity, I mean, it's clear that the electricity sector has been in crisis for a very long time. And I think it's important to remind ourselves of that it's not just been about renewable energy and the crisis of climate change. You know, the electricity sector, the supply shortages that have led to load shedding have been there for a long time because of plans to privatize in the 1990s and even earlier than that. There have been implications of the corporatization process that Eskom has gone through. We know that there's huge debt, municipal debt. There's huge debt of residents and businesses owing to Eskom and municipalities. And a lot of that is partly because the cost of electricity has gone up by nearly 400% in the last few years. At the same time, as all those problems are existing, there's remains quite high levels of energy poverty in the country, lack of access. Even where people are connected to the grid, people can't afford to switch on the lights. And then, of course, there's been the whole area of the problems within Eskom with the debt that they face, the kind of coal contracts, the cost overruns. We know there have been major problems of mismanagement, corruption, state capture. So there's been a whole stable or different groupings of problems facing Eskom. But when we stood back and said, okay, this electricity system is in crisis, let's think about the kind of electricity system we want. Who should it be aimed at? Who should be the major beneficiaries of an electricity system in the country? And how do we get there? How do we make sure that we are meeting the public sector mandate of electricity for all? But we can't just answer those questions in abstract. We actually have to say that we're looking at those questions within a context of climate change on the one hand, but an even bigger and broader sort of macro context than the background of climate change is that the neoliberal macroeconomic framework that we're operating in South Africa is impacting profoundly on the electricity sector in South Africa and is the cause of a lot of the problems that I was referring to previously. And that neoliberal macroeconomic framework has deepened in the last few years. We've seen increasing sort of austerity budgets coming from the government, increasing emphasis on neoliberal principles like full cost recovery, paying principles like that. So we've got to say, well, what can we do? How can we rescue the electricity system when we're facing these major problems of climate change and a neoliberal economic system? And we took as our starting point, on the one hand, the 1 Million Climate Jobs campaign, which started in 2011. It was was a successful alliance of trade unions, community organizations, environmental groupings, which came together to say, we need to solve the climate crisis, we need to solve the unemployment crisis, we can look at how to create 1 million climate jobs. And that was the foundation around which AIDC took on and carried this work forward. On the other hand, and I think the other sort of impetus that has led us to the point of releasing this report was that NUMSA resolution that Comrade Mbodi referred to, which said that NUMSA was going to fight for a socially owned renewable energy sector, a sector made up of a mix of energy parastatals, municipal owned entities, community energy enterprises, and cooperatives. And we said, well, if we look at that as a sector, and we don't think that that should only be the renewable energy sector, that should be what the electricity sector should be like. We want a socially owned electricity sector. And we said, you know, not much attention has been paid to Eskom, to the energy parastatal that we have in South Africa. It's generally quite severely criticized. People don't like Eskom because of the load shedding, because of you know, cutting people off who can't pay, etc. But it's a public sector body. And we said, let's look at that public sector body and see what is happening, how we can transform that public sector body to be able to meet a public mandate. We had a conference at the end of 2018 with Chewed and TNI, Num and NUMSA were there, and a whole range of other trade unionists. And out of that conference, we saw the need to set up a reference group to focus on research around how do we transform Eskom? Because it was clear coming out of that conference that there are major problems facing Eskom, that it can't just be a business as usual. We're not saying, you know, we want Eskom to continue as is. Eskom has got to be transformed. So we set up the reference group to explore the public sector approach to renewables and what it would take to transform Eskom as part of a key part of a public approach to electricity. And it was AIDC, it was Chewed, it was TNI, funded by FES, and Num and NUMSA played a central role in that reference group. Soon after the reference group had been set up, as it happened, the government then announced in early 2019 that it was intending to unbundle Eskom as part of its solution to solving the problem of Eskom going forward. And we were very clear that we didn't see the unbundling of Eskom as any kind of solution. You know, when you look at the international, when you look at the global literature, you can see that unbundling is World Bank speak for privatization. It generally leads to privatization, and the unions quite rightly and quite understandably are opposed to unbundling. So we then looked at, well, what is the, so then we pulled together this report over the last 18 months or so. And I want to go through the key arguments of the report. Our number one key argument is that it's essential for the just transition that renewable energy is done through the public sector. So we're saying, in fact, that unless renewable energy is done through the public sector, there can be no just transition. There's not going to be any kind of a just transition. There's not even going to be a transition to renewables. We are arguing that the market forces alone, or market forces, won't ensure that renewables can transition, that coal is still a very large part of the energy mix globally, and that although the share of renewables has been growing, it's growing within a growing energy cake, as it were. So it's not that renewables is overtaking fossil fuel, it's that both are growing. We also make an argument around how long the private sector will continue to invest in renewables. And we talk about the 3-fall effect. And these are issues that Sean is going to pick up in his input just now, or his talk just now. And then we said that another key part of why the renewables must be done through the public sector is because already the cost of transitioning is borne by the public sector. And you know, when the private sector takes on renewables and runs with it, it's the public sector that has to bear the cost of ensuring that the technical issues, the technical problems related to getting renewables onto the grid, increasing the amount of renewables on the grid, it's the public sector that bears that cost. And here we look at things like the role of PPAs. So we're looking at the issue of free markets, you know, that a free market of renewables competing is going to work. And we touch on the argument as well that if Eskom fails, the whole system's going to fall apart. So the whole argument around a death spiral is not going to be effective. So that's our first set of arguments, that in order to ensure that we can move with enough ambition and fast enough to renewables, we actually need renewables to be done in the public sector. Okay, so that's the first set of our arguments. The second set of our argument relate to the importance of a public utility like Eskom, a vertically integrated public utility like Eskom, and the importance of the role that Eskom needs to play in that transition and in the way going forward. And one of our arguments is that unless Eskom is playing a key role, we're not going to have the coherent, nationally planned transition that we need. An element of what we're arguing is that corporatization has in fact created the problems that we're seeing. And I want to come back to the diagram that I had up in an earlier slide, which I'm not sure if you saw it, which outlines the different elements of a socially owned renewable energy sector: the energy parastatals, the municipal owned entities, the cooperatives, community energy enterprises. We're saying that these all need to be part of a broad understanding of what the public sector is. Instead of kind of focusing on increasing the market share of renewables, we are arguing that in fact what you should be doing is looking at how to strengthen the partnership between Eskom and local government, and between Eskom, local government, and any community initiatives that exist. Community initiatives on their own cannot do enough to transition to renewable energy. And on top of that, if we're saying, well, we're going to allow sort of open competition when it comes to generation, and that an unbundled Eskom with an independent transmission company will be free to choose the best option at any one time between private sector companies, community organizations, that's not going to work. What's going to happen is that the community organizations will be pushed out by the private sector will dominate, and they will dominate on the basis of profit maximization. So the only way, in fact, for any community initiatives to work is if there's a strong public sector renewable energy, the renewable energy is strongly entrenched in the public sector, with Eskom and local government playing key roles, and a strong relationship, partnership between the two of them. Now, in our report, we haven't focused a lot on this relationship. We've seen this as a piece of work that we need to do going forward, but this is very much part of our vision. Then when it comes to the sort of finances of Eskom, we've identified the origins of the unsustainable debt as located very strongly in the commercialization of Eskom, in the huge amount of corruption and wasteful expenditure that's happened, in the cost of the IPPs. And we can't get away from the fact that those early IPPs were expensive, and that they tied Eskom into paying a particular amount for the renewable energy that they bought because of the power purchase agreement, the PPA. And that is a contract that governs the private sector renewable energy and the public sector buying that renewable energy. And it in effect puts all the risk on Eskom as the public body, because by contract it must pay for a certain amount of electricity at a certain price, even if it doesn't use that electricity. And then, of course, one of the other reasons for the unsustainable debt has been the increase in the price of coal. So we've developed a whole argument around using the government employee pension fund in order to fund Eskom. And Dominic will go into that in much more detail. So I'm sort of finishing up now. What is the way forward? And what we've identified in our report is a number of tasks that we've called them. And the first is saying that there must be a forensic audit of Eskom's debt. You know, we can't just say, well, Eskom's got this huge 450 billion debt and it must pay it off, and how is it going to pay it off? We're saying, actually, let's unpack that debt. Does Eskom actually need to pay it all off? Can some of it be declared odious debt? Can, you know, people who were paid out in a corrupt arrangement be forced to pay back the money? So those are all the areas that we need to really look at in terms of unpacking Eskom's debt and really trying to see how large it really is. Then we're saying number 2 is stop the unbundling. We don't think that that's the way. In fact, we're saying that what needs to happen is to reverse what privatization and marketization has already happened through the process of corporatizing Eskom. Then we're saying very importantly that we need to build global cooperation around the use of renewable energy technologies so that that countries aren't kind of cut out from developing a renewable energy manufacturing sector because of intellectual property rights and trade agreements and so on. That if we team up globally with like-minded public utilities and organizations around the world, we need to look at how we can build a campaign to make renewable energy technology much more accessible. Then we're saying that we need to focus a lot on building the skills, capacity, and competence of Eskom to actually do renewable energy so that Eskom can do it and we don't have to leave it to the private sector. We need to develop a planned approach to the shift to low carbon economy, and we've been very careful to use that word economy because we don't think it's just about energy. It has to be about an economy-wide move to a low carbon situation. But we can't have a developed and planned approach unless we're doing it nationally, and Eskom has to play a major role in that process. Then we're saying we need to use public financing to build a public system, and we need to build a future Eskom according to key public ethos principles, and we unpack some of those principles: affordable access for all, providing quality and efficient environmentally sustainable services, subjecting all decision-making and operational running decisions to public sector ethos criteria, expanding participation in Eskom decision-making processes, and ensuring transparent and accountable running of Eskom. So very much bringing that democratic notion into the running of Eskom, transforming Eskom into a real public sector utility. So just before I finish, just to say that I'm sure the link to the report will be posted in the chat, or it has already been posted in the chat. If you look at the report, you'll see that it is in 3 broad sections. There's, apart from the introduction and the conclusion, there's a first section which looks at the background and the context within which Eskom has found itself in the crisis within which it's in. Then we go on to look in more detail at some of the arguments around renewable energy and some of the myths around, how if we just leave it to the market, renewable energy, we will transition to renewable energy. And we've got a whole section which looks at renewable energy, brings in global experiences, global data to really unpack the issue of renewable energy. And then we've got a third section which looks at our proposals on the way forward in relation to financing, in relation to governance, and in relation to Eskom transitioning to a public utility that takes on renewable energy, uses renewable energy to generate electricity, which is then used to ensure that everybody, poor and working class communities in the country, have access to electricity as a basic service. So I'll leave it at that here, and then people coming after me are going to talk in much more detail about the different components.
Thank you so much, Sandra. I think that was properly outlined, but also exciting people about looking at the research. I appreciate that. So I'm just going to hand over then to Sean, and then we'll take it from there. Sean, would you like us to pull up your slides?
I actually just explained to Rican that I'm just probably going to speak to the slides rather the same way that Sandra did. They're not that many, but I did ask for there's a couple of charts that I would like to show later in the presentation, if that's okay.
Okay.
Okay, so thanks everybody. It's great to be part of this. Hello from Brooklyn, New York, that until recently was the center of the pandemic. So I just want to make a few opening comments about the report. And it's been a great privilege to be working with comrades and trade union comrades and others, TNI, IDC, in this, I think, extremely important exercise. There's been attacks on public energy all over the world, and there's an idea that's been carefully and often brutally cultivated that public energy companies cannot deliver on climate commitments, that they cannot deliver on energy transition, and that the private sector must lead the way and is leading the way. So this is the sort of the dominant view that is all over the debates in South Africa. I have the privilege of being able to work internationally, and I get a very good view, along with my colleagues here in New York, of what is really going on in energy. And I think that has been missing to a large part in the debates in South Africa, and I want to return to that in a moment. I would say that the contents of the report and the political implications of the report are more radical than anything that's being debated in South Africa at the moment, in the sense it reinforces the position taken by NUMSA, SAFTU, and other progressive forces close to unions, that public energy can deliver on a just energy transition. And the current model of unbundling plus the IPP system, which has been tried elsewhere, has demonstrably failed in virtually every location on the planet, whether you're in the developed world or the underdeveloped or so-called underdeveloped or developing world. It's more ambitious in terms of what it's trying to accomplish, but it is more likely to be successful than the current policy framework, which is based on market-based approaches and taking care of the needs of investors. Now, I will say that the alternative, socially owned renewable energy within the context of a transformed Eskom is not an easy lift, in the sense that there are not challenges. Of course there are challenges. Sandra referred to some of the issues we raise in the report about questions of global supply chains, of skills deficits. All of these are major challenges. But if we go down the unbundling IPP route, if we go down that path, we will end up in a quagmire of defeat and disappointment as far as the energy transition is concerned. So let's acknowledge the challenges, but understand there are ways that which we can deal with those challenges. But I want to turn now to some of the misconceptions that have dominated the discussion in South Africa. And the first sort of misconception we see is there are three highlighted in the report, in the introduction. One is that Eskom's crisis is largely its own fault. It's caused by corruption, mismanagement, poor decisions, and that if only, this is endemic to public institutions like Eskom. The second misconception is that the transition to renewables is inevitable and that private markets are working. Yes, there's been subsidies, but those subsidies are now no longer necessary, really. And what we're going to see is an explosion of renewable energy because it's cheaper. It's the least cost option. We say that's a misconception. And the third misconception is more technical, and that is that the decarbonization of the power sector in South Africa, because it has a lot of sun, because it has a lot of wind, because it has these favorable conditions, it will be relatively painless. Some of the problems that have happened elsewhere could probably be avoided. And we go into considerable detail on those misconceptions in the report. Let's start with the first misconception about the crisis of Eskom. And I'm not going to go into the financials of Medupe Kusile and all of that stuff. That's in the report. But essentially, we put forward the idea that the Eskom crisis is a synthetic crisis, in the sense that the value of producing public energy is not in the sale of electrons. it is in the social, environmental, and other effects in terms of its economy-wide implications of producing electricity. It's the same as water systems. If you can't make profit selling water, what do? Shut down the water system? No, the water system is essential to human life in the same way as electricity is essential to any minimum level living standards or any standards of economic development. So full cost recovery is this model that was put forward by the World Bank beginning in the 1980s, that consumers should pay for the service and that there should be competitive markets to make sure that prices are kept under control, and that the more people playing in the space of energy, the better it will be for consumers, etc. And this goes to the heart of the message being put forward by the neoliberal institutions, the World Bank, the IMF, and leading think tanks, that decarbonization can only be achieved through liberalization, privatization. That's where unbundling comes in. The problem for the World Bank at the moment and the neoliberals is that most of the world, and particularly the global south, is no longer privatizing its power systems. So they're basically settling on an idea of what they call the hybrid model or a single buyer model, because they understand that we can't provide a universal service and expect private interests to make money all the time, or even some of the time. So there's this balancing act that is happening in countries all over the world where the limited marketization is taking place. In South Africa, the debate is similar in the sense that the government is saying we want a hybrid model or the single buyer model. But what it's doing, and we explain this in some detail in the report, is all of the risk will go on to what remains of Eskom, and all of the certainties will go into the private sector through power purchase agreements with private companies. This is unloading risk onto the public while mitigating or preventing risk onto the private. So this is a policy crisis at the global level that will be addressed because it's inevitable. If the world, is serious about decarbonization, then the pace of decarbonization would need to be speeded up, and it would need to be done on a public goods basis, not on the basis of energy for profit. And I can't emphasize this enough. This is often completely outside of the debate in South Africa, with the exception of people in this room or on this call who are aware of what's going on. The second, or part of this, is also the problem of the death spiral. The death spiral under the IPP and unbundling will actually get worse. It won't get better, because South Africa, by even the most ambitious projections, will still be using more than 50% or 60% of electricity will be produced by coal a decade from now, and it will still continue to decline in the years to 2040 and 2050. Then what is the financial model for Eskom under those circumstances? It will mean that the generation side will be privatized, mostly through new renewables, and the costs of integrating the renewables will be put onto the transmission services, or Eskom TE. This is not going to get Eskom out of its death spiral. And one of the problems with the current narrative is the idea that if you break it up, you will make the system more attractive to private investment. And the international experience shows that there is no free market in electricity. It's all done through agreements. Nobody is going to commit millions, tens of millions of rand into developing electricity capacity, generating capacity, without a guarantee, legally binding guarantee, that that electricity will be purchased by the single buyer, in this case, Eskom. This is the IPP model. So where is the private investment? It only comes, or the private investment only materializes because of guarantees of satisfactory returns. Now, the problem with that approach are severalfold. One of the things we point to in the report is, if the current global arrangements continue, where just a few countries produce wind turbine generators and technologies, all of the high-end skills are going to be in those countries and they won't be transferred into South Africa. If the current model for solar photovoltaics is such that 3 or 4 countries dominate 70% of the market, what are the chances of a domestic industry around wind and solar developing in South Africa? The chances are none at all, because at the moment, the oversupply of these technologies globally, there's a weak demand, contrary to what's being proposed. There's a weak demand for these technologies, means that those technologies will stay in the hands of other countries. What this means is there will be a progressive loss of energy self-determination in South Africa, of energy sovereignty. And this is hugely significant, because in 15 years, 20 years, all of those solar PV systems, all of those wind turbines will need to be replaced. This means the providers of those technologies have South Africa in a very vulnerable position. Those industries can be developed domestically, should be developed domestically, but it means challenging the current arrangements at the level of the WTO, etc. I want to turn now to the other misconception that the market is producing an energy transition to renewables that is going forward at great speed. Sandra referred to the problems of the international system for renewables and the slow growth of renewable energy when we look at what we've described as an energy expansion, not an energy transition. All forms of, up until the pandemic, all forms of generation was growing. Coal was growing, gas was growing, renewables were growing, nuclear was growing, biomass was growing, because energy demand and electricity demand in particular was growing at a rate of around 4% a year. So when you see renewables growing, you think, oh, it's growing, but it's not necessarily displacing fossil fuels, on the contrary. So I want, if I can, to show what happened with the current model, but showing this slide on the investment, if we can get that up there on the investment realities. You see it there now, thank you. Sorry, I was looking at my notes. What we saw in Europe is the guaranteed power purchase agreement model of returns, guaranteed profits for renewable energy companies produced such an increase in electricity charges that there was a major political backlash. We should be clear, that backlash fuel was part of the narrative of the right wing. The right wing saying climate change doesn't exist, immigrants are the problem. So in Europe, it was part of a right wing narrative, the rising electricity costs. And this goes to the question of the death spiral of the utilities, because it's not just Eskom who's in a death spiral. If utilities can't survive, but their power is needed, then what happens is government either has to pay them to be on hold, on standby, or they basically are engaged in recouping costs through non-sale of electricity, but putting it on as administrative charges and so on. So this has been the example. In Europe, they moved away from the feed-in tariff subsidy towards auctions. This is the system that is currently here in South Africa. And then the prices of the bid prices came down quite dramatically. So the conclusion that was put forward is, you see, renewable energy is getting less expensive. But what investors saw was a fall in profit margins. So without those subsidies, there would be no satisfactory profits. Take away the subsidies, as they did in Europe through the feed-in tariff, go to an auction system, you see profit margins collapse. Investors then look at the numbers, and this is what happens. You see it in Europe, a collapse in investment in renewables and a dramatic slowdown in deployment. Can I see the next slide, please? This is not just Europe. This is also the same policies were pursued in China. Power purchase agreement, feed-in tariffs leads to an explosion of investment and then a collapse. So this is what the invisible crisis of the neoliberal model of energy for profit in renewables that will, if we think in the case of South Africa that we can do IPPs forever, we must reflect on this. It's not just more expensive, we lose energy sovereignty, but we also have an investment crisis. If the private sector can't produce returns to their shareholders, to their lenders, then we are faced with this investment crunch. much cheaper to do it in the public sector, where normally speaking, the borrowing of capital, which is backed up by government, is lower in terms of the interest rates. The main source of expense for renewable energy is the borrowing of money. It's the interest on, it's basically the borrowing costs of capital. So it's not the technologies, it's actually the interest rates. So we can reduce those. We can do a domestic industry. We can, yes, do all sorts of joint ventures for the first phase, possibly with other companies, but we need to have a public goods approach. So the last misconception, and then I'll conclude, is on the question of is it easy to decarbonize the power sector? And the report goes into quite a lot of detail about this. And just a sort of a warning, really, that it's there's quite a lot of data in there about some of the problems that are associated with it. This is not meant to say this. I wouldn't want my comments to have to be interpreted as, oh, that means renewable energy is impossible, or we shouldn't be doing renewable energy. But what we should be clear about is this idea that because there is wind and sun all over South Africa, that will turn into a modern energy system is false. And if we look at the debates in Europe and around the world, in the United States as well, the engineers and scientists who are working on grids and balancing systems are fully aware that there's two ways of solving the problem of variable power when the sun's not shining and the wind's not blowing. And that is moving large volumes of electricity from one end of a continent or a country to another where it's needed. The other, that's what they call the aggregated model. So that means lots of wind turbines, lots of solar panels. That sounds great if we're trying to create jobs, but if it's privately owned, it just means an expense that we will have to pay as the public sector. So tripling the amount of generation capacity in South Africa by 2050, which is what some of the projections are saying, would mean 150 gigawatts of wind and solar to replace the current 40 or 50 gigawatts of conventional power that exists right now. That's a massive expense. On top of that is all the transmission costs that are associated with it. So this is not an argument against renewables, it's just an argument against naivety. We need to understand that these pose real challenges. It needs to be said that decarbonization also is not just about power sector decarbonization. We can have public transport systems. That's part of decarbonization. We can have energy conservation. We could modernize infrastructure. All of that contributes to decarbonization. It's not just wind and solar technologies that need to be spread all over South Africa. The other side of the debate is energy storage. That energy storage will provide a protection against variable power when the sun's not shining and the wind's not blowing. But anybody who understands what's going on with the energy storage knows that the progress in energy storage has been limited to what they call diurnal storage. In other words, you can extend the power generated by the sun during the day using a battery into the evening hours by maybe 2 or 3 hours. Still very expensive, but technically doable. But what happens in months when there is much less sunshine, much less wind? How do you deal with that variable power? You need, unfortunately, we're still trying to grapple with that backup plans. And if we're going to need Eskom's coal to provide backup to the growing renewable sector, then that needs to be liberated from the full cost recovery restrictions that are being put on it by the current policy. A planned approach to energy transition, assessing all the available technologies is absolutely essential, and that would include nuclear power in my view. We need to look at that in a very grown-up way, but there are other technologies that need to be considered, conversion to hydrogen, etc. So I'll conclude by saying this, that we've identified the tasks associated with this analysis. I think it is an extremely rigorous and robust analysis. This report is a weapon in the hands of people who believe in public energy, who believe in energy transition, who believe in climate protection, and believe in workers' power and workers' rights. let's use the material in here because it's extremely potent in terms of challenging the dominant arguments that are in the discourse in South Africa about the inevitability of the market approach, how unbundling will solve the problems, where state-owned enterprises are the problems. I think we can build a real political movement around this involving unions and their allies. And I'm looking forward to discussing the contents of the report in other times. And forgive me, Kay, if I went on a little bit too long, but I'll stop there.
Okay, Sean, thank you so much for that. I think it was important for us to go through some of those stuff and the misconceptions that you put on the table. And I love what you said just before you came to closing, which is it's not an argument against renewables, it's an argument against naivety, which is key. So I'm just going to hand over then to Comrade Hameda to please come through.
Hi, comrades, and thank you very much to AIDC and all the organizations for giving me the opportunity to speak at this particular forum. I've been asked to look specifically from a Labour perspective, what are some of the key challenges or what are our perspectives in relation to climate change, the just transition, and then energy. I must say it's been wonderful when you're not the first speaker because the three panelists before touched on key issues which I would want to expand on. And in many instances crystallize a lot of the contentions that we currently see. So I think the first and foremost, I think to support what Comrade Mbodi had said and to pick up on Sandra's point or her presentation where she made reference to NUMSA's renewable energy social compact position. That was a resolution that NUMSA held while it was still very much part of COSATU, and NUMSA, FAO, and a couple of other affiliates within COSATU had actually been quite progressive and very forward-thinking, both in the context of climate change, but in energy in particular. And I think what was, many times people question whether Labour understands climate change. Well, I think by and large, and I speak across the federations, because Naledi as an organization has managed to, through various funding opportunities, run workshops with our Labour comrades. And, it's not that people don't understand what's happening in relation to climate change. I think if you even look at the submission that was made by NUM parliamentary committee or the representative of their parliamentary office to the portfolio committee in relation to nuclear, in relation to an energy transition and a just transition in particular, and a move away from fossil fuels, it was clear that, or it becomes clearer for those who haven't engaged with the Labour community, that comrades are very, very astutely aware of how and what capital and capitalism has done to the environment, to our economy, and how it is that we, both in terms of communities, in terms of the environment, and in terms of workers in particular, are suffering as a result. We also, in terms of the ITUC, but also at various international forums, workers and work organizations and representatives have come out quite strongly articulating that there's no job on a dead planet. So we recognize that there has to be coexistence. And so one of the things I think we probably take forward the struggle in a slightly different way in terms of paradigm is that we recognize first and foremost that the current capitalist system is responsible for the challenges and the key struggles that we're seeing in relation to climate change, and that in order to change what we're seeing, it's not about changing the climate but the system. And so we push for something called eco-socialism within a just transition framework as our challenge, and as our challenge for us as Labour, because that's something that we want to achieve. But it is our alternative to the current paradigm of capitalism and neoliberal capitalism in particular, because it's the profit making that has actually brought us to where we are now. I think then to just bring it more specifically to the issue of the just transition. So this is a word that's become quite sexy, for the lack of a better word, over the last few years. Rightfully, it is a principle that belongs to Labour, and coming from an eco-socialist perspective, Labour recognizes that as much as you have challenges around climate change and you have issues around CO2 emissions and so on, It is important that when we move away from a high carbon economy to a low carbon economy, that workers are placed at its center. You cannot have workers become the collateral damage of a system that they've already been exploited in. And therefore, the just transition principle is where workers are saying it is important to move away from a high carbon intensive to a low carbon intensive economy, but workers are the ones that have to be given due consideration and have to be taken with, in this process. So I just want to, where I depart slightly from Mbodi, it's not that we don't want workers to be worse off. People must be better off. If we're challenging the system, then communities, the environment, and workers have to be better off. And that's the just transition that we're pushing for within an eco-socialist perspective, and that is what we're wanting to see. I think what's also important to articulate is that the just transition in the context of South Africa, noting the fact that energy and Eskom has become quite a key discussion point, the just transition is almost conflated to an energy transition. And I want to reiterate the point that we do see a just transition happening in every single sector of our economy, challenging the paradigm and putting forward an alternative. And the way in which we see the energy transition taking form is that this is the sector that's leading the way, but it is not the just transition. It is an energy transition. I think what's also dangerous is that the word just transition is being taken up by various organizations presenting or articulating that they represent the particular principle. If you do not have workers central to your transition, it will never be just. If you don't have the environment and workers part of that transition, it will never be just. If you don't take the working class and working class communities with you in relation to the transition, it will never be just. So it should be clear that those three components are absolutely essential, and regardless of which sector we're trying to push for in terms of a transition, those are central elements. Without it, we have a transition. Whether it's for better or for worse it would be the proof in the pudding is when you eat it, but it wouldn't be what we as Labour understand to be a just transition. I then want to pick up on a couple of questions related to IPPs. So, in having laid the ground in terms of how we as Labour feel very strongly around wanting a just transition and recognizing that climate change is fundamentally problematic currently, and the working class and workers in particular are going to be the ones who suffer and become the collateral damage. When, as much as one can argue that we want fossil fuels to be withered away and we'd like to keep the coal in the ground, there's also a reality, and that reality is that particularly in South Africa, and I think Germany and a couple of other countries also, and I think England are also countries that can be likened to our transitioning. Coal has a particular history, and it is directly related to and tied into the political economy of South Africa, as well as the history of how our country has developed. When you do a just transition away from coal and you simply move into renewable energy or green industries, and you do not consider what the impact of a capitalist system has been on workers who work within the coal and mining sector, within the energy sector, and then a coal-fired energy system of which workers are the key victims in terms of suffering in relation to the conditions under which they work. Then there's the communities who are exposed to the high levels of pollution and water scarcity and environmental degradation. If you don't take these things into consideration and you simply put forward an argument that we want to move away from a high carbon intensive economy to a low carbon intensive economy, then you get Hendrina. And Hendrina is not the only case. There's several, if you look at our mining towns, and what has happened when mines have left the area and left places, ghost towns, it's precisely because capital has driven a particular agenda, and it's the communities and the workers that get left behind. So when we talk about moving from a fossil fuel, or even if you take it in terms of agriculture, highly processed agricultural system, to one that's a lot more sustainable, and that takes into consideration a just transition, one has to understand that there are key principles that Labour would contest. And so renewable energy is not one of them. We are definitely and 100% in support of renewable energy. But our contestation is the form in which renewable energy is currently being pushed forward. I think there was a couple of questions in relation to, can we expand on that? Well, yes, it's private. And if you take my opening statement where we said we're challenging the system, this is an opportunity in the light of the climate crisis to change the system. So if you bring in renewable energy that has the potential, of course, to transform energy and achieve energy democracy and achieve social participation and allow for actual development and also the development of new manufacturing sectors, if you do that within the context of privatization, history has shown us, and I think current day experiences also shows that privatization is about maximization of profits and not about beneficiation for the majority of the people, nor would it be the drivers of a just transition. So I think from a Labour perspective, we are all for renewable energy, but the central key question is around ownership. Labour should be a key partner in that, so too should communities. And I think those in particular, and taking our historical context, historically disadvantaged communities, if brought on board in conjunction with Labour, could fundamentally not only be the champions for a just transition using renewable energy as one aspect of a just transition in the energy sector, but we could fundamentally transform this. And if government was actually listening, noting our current situation in relation to austerity and also recession, noting that we've made really bad decisions in relation to trade, as well as the kind of industries that we've allowed to just dissipate. If we want to change our industrial strategy and use a just transition framework to be able to lead the way, then developing a homegrown, local, renewable energy sector, not necessarily interested in wanting to compete with China and everybody else who's got the competitive edge in terms of solar panels, but doing it for us as South Africans. Jobs, environment, people, community, all of these elements will be addressed absolutely fundamentally, and we would see ourselves in a much better space. But obviously we need a government who both supports a just transition, understands the role for renewable energy outside of IPPs, and is truly committed to addressing the issues of jobs and the poverty that our communities and our country currently faces. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Hameda. Yeah, you gave us a lot to actually think about and also setting the record straight. This has been extremely fantastic. I'm just gonna hand over to Ndata David, but before Ndata David comes in, I also just want to remind us, comrades, that let's try to sort of limit our interventions. And I also want to say that it's extremely exciting that there's a brief debate and exchange of thoughts onto the comment section, which is the chat. If you have any burning questions, please don't forget to put it on the Q&A. So Ndata David, if you can please come through.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, Ndata David.
Okay, thank you for the opportunity, Kia.
But Ndata David, we can't see you. We can't see you. We're looking at your beautiful ceiling. We would like to see you. We can't see you.
You want to see me?
Yes, there we go.
Can you see me? Okay. Yeah, thanks for the opportunity. And I don't want to spoil what the comrades, the colleagues have just put on the table. I just want to come up with, we as NUM have just prepared to say what is it that we want to see in Eskom and seeing the achieving of just energy transition for the whole of South Africa. The question that was posed, it's about how to ensure a democratic Eskom going forward that is swept clean of corruption. I will start by saying strict security measures must be in place. If we don't have those measures, we can even source them from outside, like we are doing as a country when we source engineers into the country, so that we deal with the corruption in Eskom. Secondly, we have what we say can assist Eskom, the workplace democracy, is what modern companies or organizations adopt to make their employees more engaged with their jobs. A workplace democracy can be anything from direct democracy to employers asking opinions of employees without taking into consideration their benefits, their beliefs or opinions. Most important consideration for a democratic workplace. We want to consider this transparency. If we can have the transparency whereby stopping of secret agendas, stopping of secret plans, share information with us as employees and as members of the labor movement to help build trust and makes employees feel more engaged with the business. We secondly want to put this to say, let Eskom allow for dialogues where management start asking employees about their concerns, questions they have about the business and their thoughts on improving the business. We also want to see practicing of true open door policies within the organization of ours, which is Eskom. And again, if they can avoid the hierarchy where management are avoiding to recognize other departments, recognizing other departments more than the other departments. And there's no department that exists within the organization that is better than the other department, so to say. And the way they are doing their delegate, it's not what is happening on the ground. We as labor, we see it as if it must be correct that they delegate it the right way. They be clear about employees' tasks so that everyone knows their jobs and how they impact the business. And again, they must hold people responsible. How? People will be held responsible to the delegated responsibilities. Something that goes wrong, then they'll have to blame someone. We don't want to see such things. And they mustn't promote a culture of blame if one hasn't done his job and look for a scapegoat. And we are saying again, recognize achievements. By recognizing achievements to those who do great in public, can be an individual department, can be of grade. And then constant evaluation can also assist Eskom by having frequent self-assessment to improve the way of doing business. Be willing for your assumptions to be challenged. Review the company policies for relevancy. Times are changing and the workplace is dynamic environment. We cannot allow militant type of policies that are becoming redundant at this present moment. We also want to see inputs from employees being taken care of. And we want again to see leadership at all levels, not to have bosses or people who will operate as mafias. That will where you need to fear them, but have decision makers to direct whenever necessary. And if that can be in Eskom, we are seeing Eskom going forward. With that having said of the corruption within Eskom, we can achieve more. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Can you hear me, Kia?
I can definitely hear you, Dr. David. I was
Yeah.
I was internalizing the powerful words that you just gave us now. So I appreciate that, Dr. David.
Yeah.
So, dear comrades, I'm going to then hand over to Dominic Brown to give us sort of a clear discussion in relation to the finances and how we're thinking of getting out of all of this schmuck. Dominic?
Thanks, Kia. And unlike Hameda, it's quite difficult to follow all these great speakers that have come before me because all those presentations have been quite powerful. I think I'd like to start really by making a preliminary point. And it relates to the kind of context that I think we're going into right now. And what we're seeing globally and in South Africa is a massive crisis, socio-economic crisis that we're seeing. People that have never gone hungry before are going to be going hungry. The unemployment rate will be on levels that's just unimaginable. We can think about the only reference point for us, rather, in terms of the scale of this crisis, is the 1929 to 1933 Great Depression. And by many estimates, this crisis is going to be bigger than that. And so I think it's within this context that we have to think about both how we address the massive ecological emergency that we're facing, but also this massive social crisis. And I think that it's in this context that there's going to be lots of discussion and debate right now about what the kind of energy transition looks like in South Africa. And I think that's the context that we're having this debate. And to echo Hameda, the idea behind this is not to say no to renewables. In fact, we're fully behind the renewables, as Sandra has been pointing out for a very long time. The point is that we need to do it in a way that ensures that no one is left behind. And so I think it's in that context then that we took up this research and this work alongside our various partners. And then I think that then leads me into this presentation, which not only looks at where we can find some of the resources for financing this just energy transition and a just transition in general, as Sandra was pointing out earlier on. And maybe we can go to the next slide. And so I'm going to give an overview of the debt crisis, what we're seeing right now, an historical overview of Eskom, and some of the key elements rising out of that, driving Eskom's debt today. But then also looking at the relationship between Eskom's debt, our public debt in general, and rising austerity, before looking at some of the alternatives. And so, next slide, please. So since 2017, South Africa's total debt stood at about 358 billion rand. And in March 2019, that had grown to 445 billion rand. And based on this trajectory at this stage, we should be around 500 billion rand or half a trillion. And a quarter of this debt is actually owed to public entities. And when trying to understand Eskom's growing debt, many attribute the problem to corruption alone. Next slide, please. But the one before this one, but what we have seen is that, oh, I must have missed the slide, that understanding the debt requires a historical, political, economic analysis of Eskom as an energy public utility within the broader history and political economy of South Africa. So in this regard, while corruption is one aspect or element that has contributed to rising Eskom debt, it is not the only aspect. And the previous slide, yeah, thanks. And in analyzing the origins of Eskom's debt, it has become quite apparent that there are at least 4 key elements that has created the unsustainable position that the SOE finds itself in today. The first one really relates to commercialization, which I'll touch on a bit more now. The second relates to corruption and wasteful expenditure, which has been brought onto the popular the mainstream narrative for some time now. The third is independent power producers, The fourth is the increasing price of coal between 2008 and 2010. And when we come to this by locating this within a historical trajectory, and when looking at when Eskom was formed in 1923, it was an explicitly public, not-for-profit entity. And it was in fact forced by the state, by law, to sell electricity at cost price. And it was also exempt from paying taxes. And so this cheap electricity was really the backbone of a growing mining, transport, and manufacturing industry in South Africa. And it was able to play a critical role in the development of the South African capitalist economy. And then fast forward, I'm just taking out three major events. Fast forward, and we see the onset of commercialization in 1987. And this is really where the parastatal's not-for-profit status was removed, and it was from then on required to raise capital commercially. And this trajectory was continued by the ANC in 1998, following the Eskom Amendment Act, which then required Eskom to become, or made Eskom become a limited liability company with share capital, sorry. And the state was still is the sole shareholder. And it was thus then required, and from this point, a lot of its tax exemption was really lost. And so, but it's in this context then that we also see that Eskom is required to fulfill its mandate to roll out electricity or provide electricity for all. And when you have this commercialization, particularly within the context of what Sean was raising, the adoption of a neoliberal shibboleth, the idea of full cost recovery inside of the user must pay principle, which has thus made, within the context of mass unemployment, huge poverties, and massive inequalities, electricity unaffordable for most people. And so very little of the cost. There was some limited success in the early stages from 1993 to 1999. Electrification for the population increased by about 30%, from 36% to 66%. So there was some limited success, and of course this was able to be done because it is a public utility. But when these costs had to be repaid back by the users, it was unaffordable for most, and as a result, a very small proportion of the electrification costs was actually recovered from most of its users. But then, on the other hand, you see, as a result, in order to make up these costs, massive rises in electricity prices, and as Sandra already pointed out, in the past decade, electricity prices rose by more than 400%. And the implementation then of the prepaid water meter devices, of course, was a regressive measure that hasn't helped in relation to this issue. But then on the other hand, you have massive or intensive energy users who form part of what is called an intensive energy users group. And these corporations and parastatals include as well, use the major share of the electricity generated in the country. For example, the mining and industrial sectors use about 60% of the total electricity generated. And this is usually disproportionate to the amount that residential users consume, which is less than 20% of the total energy generated. Nonetheless, it's these massive intensive users who pay who don't pay their fair share in electricity prices. So there is in fact another way of redistributing wealth to these major corporations. And if you look at this intensive energy group here, it's a small group, and they take use more than 40% of the total electricity consumed in South Africa. And you can see some of them here, or examples of some of them here include Lonmin, Glencore, Anglo Gold Ashanti, Goldfields, and so on, predominantly mining companies, but it also includes PPC, Consol, Transnet, Tonga, Dulot, and Cecil. So this is really the one of the major issues resulting in Eskom's debt crisis. And of course, behind the users not paying puts lots of pressure on municipalities who are highly indebted as well. And the big corporations are not paying their fair share. And now, then what we see is the another major problem that we're seeing is the rise of the, can we move to the next slide, please? The rise of the independent power producers. Now, while it is true that the costs or the price of that we're paying for renewable energy from IPPs has come down as a result of increased competition, contracts have become less expensive as a result with new bidding windows and so on. What we do see, however, is that when you take these costs and you weigh them out with the average from the costs that we were locked into with the purchase power agreements, the 20-year PPAs earlier on, then these average costs, while being lower than the initial prices, remain considerably high. And this is why we're seeing from Eskom's annual financial statements from March last year, that the IPP costs increased, or rather the IPP purchases were 4.8% of total energy generation or production, but they costed 25% of the total primary energy cost. So the locking into this PPAs and the rollout of IPPs remains a major constraint on the Eskom on Eskom's finances. Then we also, as we were talking about, were issues in the relation to coal. And here there's really, we've seen a massive, as you can see by this graphic, a massive increase in the cost of coal. And there's really two phenomena behind this. The one relates to the policies that promoted BEE contracts in relation to coal, and that have been paying these BEE contractors at prices above market rates. And what we see is that the profits of this, what Pravin Gordhan has lamented for being excessive profits in December last year, where when looking at the price of, or the profits generated from these coal contracts. And what we are seeing is that besides these political contracts, on the other hand, is a second major issue, and that is that as in the past, historically and traditionally, South Africa only exported its high quality coal. But more and more, India and China has entered the market looking for low quality coal. And so we've also been now exporting low quality coal. And this is the low quality coal that Eskom has been used to generate electricity. As a result, Eskom has been paying higher prices for coal in order to compete or outcompete the new Chinese and Indian demand. And so this is really what lies behind this massive increase in coal prices. It's both the BEE contracts as well as the massive trade liberalization of the coal market and the demand for low quality coal. And the point that I forgot a moment ago in relation to the BEE contracts is that despite these profits going up at these soaring rates, as what Praveen was saying, are excessive profits, what we see is a massive decline in the wage share in coal, dropping from 42% or 42 Rand per 100 Rand of gross value added to less than to 25 Rand per 100 Rand of gross value added. So really this is massive profits going to a very few individuals. And so what this really means is now that we're moving into a period where what the implications of this is and why we shouldn't be using our financial, the debt is a problem and it's unsustainable and it needs to be addressed. The problem is that by using the fiscus or the budget to service these costs, we are crowding out resources from public services. So we already seen that at the medium-term budget policy statement in October last year, that 160 billion Rand is being proposed to be cut. An additional 161 billion was also proposed to be cut over the next 3 years from the public sector wage bill. And really what we're seeing is a declining or a shrinking public sector where the state is playing a much smaller role and pushed to play a much smaller role in order to service our debt. And what we're seeing in the context of COVID-19, where the global economy is in a recession and the South African economy was already in a recession going into the COVID pandemic, is that we are in a context where we might turn into a depression as a result of this. So we really need to think about ways of shifting the debt off the government's balance sheet. And this is where the idea, instead of pushing for greater austerity and to push for the kinds of fiscal stimulus that we need, as well as transitioning to a low carbon economy, requires thinking about what other ways can we look to finance Eskom's debt and the just transition. What's already been raised has been a public audit and a forensic audit of Eskom's debt. I think the second real major issue or point here is that we need to move towards greater conditional finance from public entities like the Government Employees Pension Fund, which already has borrowed money to Eskom. And this can be increased quite dramatically, shifting from the SOE's current debt situation, where more than 75% is to private entities, to greater public entities financing its debt. And this is because you have greater control when you are borrowing domestically. You also don't have pressures of exchange rates in addition to that. And so this is really the way to go. And this also allows workers to say what kind of transition we need going forward. And included in this, obviously, would be looking to regulate coal contracts and very importantly, to stop unbundling and IPPs. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you so much, Dominic. I think we could go on for like it's quite significant amount of time and really looking at why Eskom is in the problems that it is in, and some of the suggestions that we have put forth to sort of take it out of it. But this is why it's important for comrades to engage with the research document and keep on looking at some of the things that we'll be posting on social media to help us sort of break down the document into small chunks and to answer some of the key questions. But that being said, we are going to sort of run a little bit over time. So I was just thinking that we might just read 2 or 3 questions that have been posed on the question and answer column, and then I'd comrades and the panel can decide which ones I'd like to take up and just briefly cover it before we let the last 2 speakers come in. Are we all comfortable with that, comrades? Great. So then one of the first questions, which literally comes hot on the tails after Dominic presented, was on the ODS Eskom debt, to what extent is interest contributing towards the escalation of its debt? And then another one is, to what extent is corruption to blame for Eskom's problems? Another question is, I'm being a little bit generous. Another question is, what do the panelists think about the expropriation of all energy sources under democratic public control and the broader socialized energy space? What about community initiatives? And then sort of the lastest question for us to tackle, which is, what are your positions on hydropower and nuclear power in the SADC region? So Bob was still gathering ourselves. I think I'm going to let Dominic come in and maybe talk us through a little bit around to what extent is interest contributing towards the escalation of Eskom's debt.
I think that it's both South Africa's high borrowing rates, because we have high, our domestic borrowing rates are generally quite high. It's about 0.5% lower than international market borrowing rates. But moreover, what we've seen is we've shown that exchange rates also play a major contribution. So for instance, if you look at the World Bank loan to Eskom in 2010, it was at an exchange rate at just above 7 Rand. And today it's more than 17 Rand. So the massive depreciation of the Rand and the volatility of the Rand also contributes dramatically to the levels of debt we pay back. And just for instance, in relation to the World Bank loan, even though we've been paying back consistently for the past 10 years, we will only be able to, or we will only see the ending of the payment of the loan by the end of the century. And that just shows you how a loan of just $3.75 billion locks you into international finance institutions and to an economy that doesn't that works for the few.
Thanks, Dom. Comrade, just another question, which is, what do panelists think about the expropriation of energy sources under democratic public control and the broader socialized energy space? What about community initiatives? Does anyone like to take that question? Please go ahead.
I can make a brief. I think it's a. Sorry, Mbodi. Do you want to?
No,
maybe
go ahead.
Okay.
Go ahead.
I think it's something that we could have a whole webinar on its own. I think it's a whole big issue on its own. I think we're certainly not opposed to community energy. I think we're just aware of the limitations of community energy. Because even with community energy, there's huge costs involved. Who's going to pay those costs? You know, you can do community energy in a way which is simply part of the neoliberal game plan to shove the responsibility for basic services onto communities, so that, you know, the state has less of a financial responsibility. So I think we have to be careful with community energy. But I think that when we talk about community energy, we have to see it as part of a coherent whole. You know, we can't have community energy without local government and Eskom playing key roles. So that would be my contribution.
Thanks, Comrade Sandra. Comrade Enos, would you like to comment?
Yes. I think Sandra started well when she said there is something that needs to be done with regards to this community participation. So I think the submission that one wants to make here is probably what we need to do is to make sure that we research properly with regards to the limitations and how to break them, because we even if it should be collaborative between the parastatals and what, we shouldn't avoid the fact of dealing with the stumbling blocks that have been set up by capitalist system. So it is important to research properly on these matters and say, how do we break the bottlenecks? And doing that together with the communities. Also, talking to exactly the limitations that you have already noted, that Sandra has already noted. I think we just need to go line per line and say what can be done in order to also allow them to play a role, even if they don't want to be in a certain collaborative, collaborating with the parastatal. If they want to go at it alone, what are the pros and cons? And I do believe it is possible to say this is what we think are the limitations, and this is what we think can be used to break those bottlenecks. Mobilizing the communities also to make input with regards to how they think the bottlenecks can be broken. And I think that is the best way forward that we can come up with, than to imagine that perhaps the only way they can participate is only through collaboration. Perhaps let's investigate everything. And I know that perhaps time it's not on our side, but I think we should try to make sure that we investigate that further, as Sandra has said.
Thank you so much, Comrade. But I think we shouldn't be limited in relation to the in terms of time. I think it doesn't mean that when we end this conversation it dies here and now. It's important for us to make sure that we will continue these conversations. We'll continue to have such a platform. So if some of the questions are not tackled right now, we have written them down and taken note of them. So in other spaces we can be able to tackle them, or for in our next webinars we'll sort of try to incorporate it within. So comrades, please don't worry about that. But considering again time, I'm hoping to let our two final speakers rather come in. I think it's important to give them the platform to speak, and maybe some of the questions, thoughts, and comments can be tackled with the two final speakers. So that being said, I was hoping that Comrade Vavi could please come in right now. And thank you, Comrade Vavi.
Afternoon, Kia. Thank you very much for inviting me to participate. Good afternoon to all of the fellow panelists and members and activists who are watching this discussion. And let me first thank the comrades who have been involved in the research, and we welcome this initiative with open hands, and we're happy that NUMSA and the NUM have formed part of the discussions over a period of time, shaping a discussion that we're having today. Research always helps us improve our innovations as the organization. They help expand our thinking, and they help us think, as they normally say in the lingo of today, think outside the box. So this is absolutely important for us, and I hope that we will find a way, as Kia have been saying, of ensuring that this discussion and the results of this research are shared beyond just the tens of people participating in this discussion, but we'll find a way of ensuring that we share them not only with our members at Eskom, but also with the broader members of the working class, so that all of us can have a proper appreciation of the challenges that we are facing. Well done to all of you comrades who have made presentations to help us want to read the research, and excellent job indeed. And we cannot ask for more than what we have done. Thank you very much, comrades. Now we're dealing with how we received the report and what is the context of our own battles. How I wish that we were not living in a globalized capitalist system. how I wish that the big push that has been going on for some time now to privatize, to commercialize, and to push the boundaries of public ownership thinner and thinner by the growing capitalist class that have much more confidence than any other time, that is buttressed by states that it is able to blackmail into advancing their own goals, not just here at home, but everywhere else in the world. How I wish that what Dominic Brown was saying have not happened, that we didn't see a push away from public ownership that we saw in 1923 under the whites-only government, to commercialization of 1987, and to further driving of neoliberal approaches from 1987 until today. And comrades, how I wish that there was only one trade union movement in Eskom. And that how I wish that there was only one federation in the country. And how I wish that the working class power was much more than it is now, represented by disunity and fragmentization of the trade union movement. And how I wish that the ANC have not turned against itself and what it stood for historically, and that it was not the face of neoliberalism and the push of commercialization, instead of reversing what the initial party economic program was at least beginning 1990. And how I wish that the working class could have united against the ANC and its neoliberal program that have meant that we're now battling with the independent power producers. We're battling with a crisis at the ecology level and environment, and we're battling with the death and diseases that are spreading to maim and kill hundreds and thousands of our people in Emalahleni and elsewhere in the Mpumalanga province, including here in Gauteng. And how I wish that all of these negative things that can demoralize us didn't exist. But unfortunately, comrades, they exist for us to engage with. The reason why we're saying that the struggle continues under different conditions all the time is precisely because we know that nothing remains static. At some point, the trade union movement was very powerful. We're now facing a trade union movement that must be rebuilt. At some moment in the beginning of the 80s, right through the 90s, there was such a strong connection between the trade union movement and the civil society working class formations in the townships. And unfortunately, we are now talking in a context where those links must be strengthened so that workers can appreciate that their battles they must wage in workplaces must be the same battles that they must wage in their communities. The battles must be taken up, and the battles will not be suspended. We will go to church to pray, but we know that prayer alone, even for the believers, does not help very much. What helps is the struggle. As we have always said, power concedes nothing without the struggle. And this particular battle must be a battle that we must be determined to win. And I must say that under the dark and the cover of the regulations that limit us to a meeting with only 50 workers, the regulations that have imposed a curfew from 9 o'clock until early hours of every day, the regulations that have undermined the freedom of assembly and the freedom to demonstrate and to advance the economic interest of the working class. We are now seeing a government that is simply on an overdrive to liberalize and to undermine even the gains that we have registered post-1994. Under the cover of the regulations, the government have now broken down Eskom into 3 pieces. Under the dark cover of regulations, the independent power producers are now given a free rein to profit at the expense of Eskom, and in a clear strategy to ensure that privatization is brought about as a reality. By the time they lift all of the regulations, we may find out that we've lost not only Eskom, but we have lost Tinel, we're losing SAA, we're losing SA Express, and all other state-owned enterprises are in a brink of falling and going as part of the Great Depression that all of you have spoken, the hard-hitting depression that visited South Africa between 1929 and 1933. The question is not to lament. The question, in my view, is what should we do at this moment? And the basic answer to that question have to lie as to whether really we think that, notwithstanding all of the fragmentization and the weaknesses in the labor movement, there is no possibility to reach out for SAFTU and COSATU to reach out to one another. The NUM and NUMSA, or NUMSA and the NUM, have been doing very well and have been the only shining example in South Africa that shows that workers can reach out to one another, hold each other's hands, and completely ignore the logos, the history, and some differences that may exist between them. The other such examples have existed in the transport strike in South Africa a year or 2 ago. I think that that type of a unity is that what should inspire us. And we need that unity, Comrade Enos and Comrade David. And we must rely on the activities and actions of shop stewards at Eskom to drive that unity and to make sure that the leadership of the 2 most important industrial unions in our country, NUMSA and the NUM, can reach out to one another, and more importantly, can pursue a non-sectarian struggle, a struggle that involves all, irrespective of other misgivings that we may have about these other forces politically. Let me make an example about this. There was a march led by the EFF earlier. How I wish that that march could have been better coordinated with NUMSA and the NUM, and how I wish that that march would have signaled a beginning of a more united working class instead of being seen as a competition as to who has a greater capability to take up issues of Eskom. And that sectarian approach and the reluctance or even fear on the part of some of us to participate in those type of demonstrations is exactly what the capitalist class wishes that we will have in South Africa in perpetuity. Perpetuity that NUM will go on its own and will be crushed. Comrade NUMSA will go on their own and they will be crushed. COSATU will try and be crushed. The Mpumalanga communities will try and be crushed. And the people in Wentworth will try on their own south of Durban and will be crushed. The people in Kolobeni will try on their own and will be crushed. Abahlali baseMjondolo will try on their own and will be crushed. The women who are resisting the evictions, in particular in the context of the COVID-19, will fight on their own and will be defeated. SAFTU will try on its own and will be defeated. And eventually, the working class as a whole will have defeats written in their foreheads in such a manner that will demobilize the efforts to mobilize the working class in the future. So my taking of this opportunity, comrade, is to once more make a passionate plea to every working class component and its leaders at this moment to realize the crisis that we are entering in South Africa and elsewhere in the world, and that without that unity, we're dead in the water, we're going nowhere, and we will be defeated one by one. Thank you very much, comrades.
Thank you so much, Comrade Vavi, for, as the kids would say, dropping bars and taking it home that we need to strive and push for thorough and important unity. Thank you for driving that home. That is a particularly important point. And I believe that the process of putting together the research and the research document itself is one of the steps that we're wanting to take in relation to building proper, thorough, and authentic unity so we can win what we need to win. That being said, I'm going to hand over to Comrade Fiona, who's going to give us sort of an appetite in relation to what does it mean for us to work towards unity, solidarity, and alternatives from a global perspective. Thanks, Fiona.
Thank you, Kia. Never an easy job following Comrade Vavi, I have to say. And Vavi, I wanted to also convey my condolences because I believe you've lost some family members in this COVID crisis. So I think Sean earlier said that what we have is a weapon. So this report is 18 months work. It's been an amazing process. And as Vavi said, it's been a joint Kusatu Saftu Numsunum process primarily. A lot of environmental organizations have been involved in this process. So I think the process alone has laid a really good basis. It's been very impressive to see the high level of knowledge that we've had in the room. South Africa has amazing resources. There is a lot of intellectual and knowledge resources in the country. And if we could pull them all together more often, I think we have a good chance of winning some of these struggles, at least at the level of argumentation. But what you have here is a nearly 200-page document. It's extremely thorough. It should really be worked by everyone on all fronts, like we used to do in the 1980s. Every sector needs to take this document and see what it means for them. We need to reach out to journalists. I saw a lot of pre-press around the report, which is really good. So we have something that can help unify and also answer some of the argumentation, because as Sean also was outlining, there's so many misconceptions and so many myths, and we feel we don't have enough information to answer those, but actually we do, and this report is a resource for that. I wanted to also say there's other resources out there. The institute that I work for and also TUED, part of our function is to provide resources for movements all over the world to help with these kinds of struggles. So we provide knowledge resources. And I send Rekan a few links just so that there's at least 3 books that are very, very easy for popular education purposes, documenting the kinds of struggles, alternatives, successes that have been achieved elsewhere in the world. And part of that's also to try and link up these struggles, because I think quite a few of the speakers have also touched on the fact that Eskom is not unique and South Africa is not unique. There are many, many places around the world that are facing exactly the same problems, where utilities are in the same position, and for reasons that Sean very knowledgeably outlined. So part of our job is also to help link those up so that we're building a common narrative, we're pushing back and we're popularizing an informed narrative, we're helping to have informed global debates, and we're moving forward as one global movement. One of the books that we produced recently, which I hope the link is in the chat, is about the trend towards taking what should be public services back into public hands. There is a trend towards that, primarily because the private sector, as soon as profits drop, and essential services can never be profitable. These are universal services that are supposed to be the infrastructure for our societies and our economies. They have to be universal. And if you make it profitable, only some will be able to pay, and ultimately the private sector pulls out. So we mapped all the cases of remunicipalization that we could find. We continue to build this database. The database is also publicly available. We'll maybe have to send that link, because I forgot to pull that one out, send that link with the letter about the video and so forth. And it would be good to add any cases you may have from South Africa. But it's also a way of introducing people, inspiring people, and learning from the practice that is being done elsewhere. I think the other thing about the importance of a global movement is the fact that there is a global architecture out there. So no country's an island, and particularly not after 4 decades of neoliberalism. There's a whole international architecture, international laws, treaties that constrain what is possible. And those laws and treaties being made in the interest of transnational corporations, effectively. So we have a big challenge also in understanding those constraints and working together to make sure that we undo that, undo those rules and laws that are not in the public interest. And one of them, for example, is investor-state dispute mechanisms. The South African government, by the way, has taken a very good position on that, and they cancelled all their bilateral investment treaties with Europe. But these investment protection clauses often constrain governments, also at local level, of taking actions, for example, moving into renewable energy where it threatens the profits of certain companies. And they can sue, they can actually literally bankrupt states if they wish. And states have no chance to bring cases themselves. And there's no consideration of public interest. So that kind of thing has to be undone. There's a big global campaign. ARDC is part of that campaign. So it would be good to also generalize that and help people to make those connections. What else do I want to say? I think the main point that this research is making is that public services have to be led by the state. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's all state-owned. There is space, I think, for non-profit community co-ops, for some private dimensions, but it has to be coordinated, regulated, and the infrastructure has to be owned by the state. These are public goods, they're the people's goods, and we have to defend them. We are producing a report with TUED sometime earlier next year, where we're going to be using some of the mainstream data from Bloomberg and the International Energy Agency and so forth, and reinterpret that data, because often the analysis that you see put out in the mainstream press and so forth is not interpreted from the perspective of the public interest. So that will be our challenge, is to take that data and provide information, argumentation that all of you can use, and everyone around the world who's involved in similar struggles, to start reversing this narrative and really asserting very strongly another view. Financing is often I mean, that's what you often see popularly, as people say, yeah, but we can't afford it. How are we going to finance this transition? How are we going to deal with Eskom's debt and so forth? There's 2 other resources we put out. One is called Financing the Future We Want, which looks quite broadly at the possibilities of raising public finance. Very interesting statistic came out of that, which is that all the public money available around the world, whether in sovereign wealth funds or public banks or any kind of public institution, there's enormous amounts of public money. So there are a lot of options before going to the private financial markets and becoming slaves to those markets. There's a lot of other options to be explored. That public money amounts to 93% of global GDP. So let that sink in a minute. That's an awful lot of money. So there are options. You know, the private market is not the only option out there. I wanted to end just having made that reference to slaves to the private financial markets. You know, when slavery was abolished, the Brits had to pay off. Well, first of all, they had to buy all those slaves from the slave owners. And this was in 1833. And they used 5% of their GDP, or 40% of the national annual budget at that point, in order to do that. That debt was only paid off in 2015. Yeah, so it is possible for a serious investment to be made in transitions, just transitions from one bad thing to one good thing. And it is possible to take 282 years to pay that debt off. That is possible. So if you want to read more about that, look at our How to Finance the Future We Want book. I want to thank everyone involved. I think the inputs were really rich. I hope that we're going to see this report being used as a resource very widely in the coming months and years. And I hope that we have some kind of impact on the policy path chosen by the South African government. But ultimately, it's going to depend very much, as Vavi said, on the struggles that are forged, the kind of unity that we can forge between unions, environmentalists, communities, and start rebuilding popular power. Thank you.
Thank you so very much, Fiona. I think I'm extremely excited the fact that we let you come through at the very last to pull everything together. And of course, again, like the kids say, drop bars. So thank you so much, comrades. I was just hoping maybe do our panelists have a final word of closure, just a message for everyone to take home. If not, final message to take home. Are we fine? Okay, Comrade Vavi.
Yeah.
Are we fine, Comrade Enos?
I just wanted to say something quickly.
One
if you would
sentence,
allow.
Comrade Enos, one sentence. We're not going to have a shop steward.
Yeah, but that is who I am. I'm a shop steward. The point that I want to make is the document is not good if it doesn't translate to some actions. And I think we need to take from Comrade Vavi that there should be a unity of purpose, and we should have inclusive campaigns that include the poor and working class, the communities, and everybody who is a stakeholder here. So I'm saying the document is good, but we must take it out of the print and take action using it. Thank you so much.
Viva Comrade Enos. Okay, so now I'm excited that I let you speak last. Thank you so much, committee. Do we have any other of the speakers who want to say a final comment before we close? All right, that being said, I'm going to echo what Comrade Enos said, which is we need to take the document and bring it to life through serious forms of action, and we need to keep Eskom public and no to unbundling. And also, I'd like to say it's exciting the way technology works because it looks like Comrade Vavi is all the way in San Francisco. Thanks, comrades. Be safe.
Thanks, comrade.
Bye.
Thank you.
Good to see you, Zwelinzima. Good to see you all.